Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Skrodszki. I am a graduate fellow here at the University of Michigan, working with Professor Jovanovic. My particular research area has to do with optical methods for identification and characterization of nuclear material, which Professor He so kindly introduced previously. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge my peers and mentors with whom I worked over the duration of the last 2 years at Pacific Northwest National Lab, namely Professor Sivananand Harilal, featured in the left, and Dr. Mark Phillips, featured in the right. Hopefully we can continue our collaborations in my graduate work in the future. And without further ado, let's go into the bulk of my presentation. Optical techniques use laser-induced plasma and have various applications ranging from nuclear safeguards, which I'll be speaking about, to space exploration. One such example is the Mars Curiosity rover, featured over here in this photo, which uses a laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy system for the characterization of Martian soil and atmosphere. So how does it all work? An intense pulse laser is focused onto a target and deposits enough energy to generate a plasma, which consists of excited atoms, ions, molecules, nano and microparticles. The plasma expands and interacts with the surrounding environment and cools, emitting electromagnetic radiation. This emission serves as a very useful diagnostic tool through spectroscopy, and through fingerprinting techniques you can identify constituents of the plasma and therefore constituents of the targets. Some such techniques I have listed here. The prominent are optical emission spectroscopy, also known as laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, which is used again by the Mars rover. That simply looks at the emission of the plasma, and a typical emission spectroscopy system is featured in this schematic. So you have your ablation laser firing at a target, depositing energy, forming a plasma, and you've got collection optics, spectrograph, and detector system to analyze those emission features. Another notable technique, kind of the inverse of emission spectroscopy, is absorption spectroscopy. So in this, you shine a tunable wavelength laser through the plasma onto a detector, and whichever wavelengths are absorbed correspond to those fingerprint features within the plasma, which are then used to identify constituents of the plasma. So why do we even look at optical techniques? Here I've listed some pros and cons of the laser-induced plasma optical techniques, which I spoke about. So particular advantages: it's largely non-destructive and near instantaneous. So the pulsed lasers used for ablation of the target are on the order of nanoseconds or even shorter, and you're looking at the emission of light. So obviously that's going to be instantaneous. So your limitations for detection are purely the electronic instruments used for detection, whereas you compare that to something like the traditional radiation detectors, which have longer counting durations for detection of radiation. It also has remote detection capability. Professor He briefly mentioned that, and one of my projects here is actually going to look at the distance limitations at which we could do such measurements. High spatial and temporal resolutions, micrometer and femtosecond, below femtosecond even, respectively. And my personal favorite, it has a vast parametric space for signal optimization. So you can vary the laser parameters, the target parameters, the detection technique to either enhance or reduce signal dependent on the application. Some particular notable disadvantages: it's difficult to look at trace elements and multi-element targets. One such example you could see in the lower right-hand side spectrum. The sodium line, the sodium line over here in blue is of much higher intensity than any of the trace uranium lines with red labels. And also notice how congested the spectrum is for the uranium lines. This is due to the high Z properties of uranium. It has a lot of electrons, so obviously a lot of electronic transitions through the cooling process, and you get a lot of congested emission. So it can be difficult to look at such spectra without high resolution spectrometers. Again, to compare to the standard radiation detection techniques, this is more of a material detection identification measurement than radiation detection. So some examples of some previous work. Over on the left-hand side are some examples of the work being applied, and we vary some parameters, such as in this study, Kyle Hardig, a previous member of our group, just graduated with his PhD from Penn State under Professor Jovanovic, did a study in which he varied the ablation laser pulse width and looked at the signal-to-noise ratio with a uranium line, and you could see how much it fluctuates just varying the pulse width of the ablation laser. Some of my previous work, looking at a uranium line with an absorption measurement, just varying the ambient gas surrounding the target between air in the red and nitrogen in the blue, signal increases almost 5 times. Now, over on the right-hand side, we have examples of this optical techniques being used for characterization of isotopes of uranium, differentiating between U-235 and U-238. These are just atomic measurements, and there is work being done on the molecules, which I'll briefly talk about later, to try to characterize the isotopic shifts and identify various isotopes. Some other more recent work that I've done personally, using a dual pulse laser ablation technique to increase signal. Here is an example of the resultant spectrum. So the standard signal pulse is shown in red, and the dual pulse significantly enhances the signal and stimulates the emission of particular uranium species shown in the black. And getting back to the molecular work, looking at uranium oxides for isotope separation and distinction, we did this measurement recently, comparing uranium metal to a glass-containing uranium, and you could see again those matrix effects are prevalent in the glass sample because the uranium signal is nearly very mitigated compared to the pure uranium sample. And so where are we now? The topic was brought up of UO2F2, urinal fluoride, which is a byproduct of the enrichment process, and kind of what we are stepping towards is looking for urinal fluoride. So a critical step in the enrichment process of uranium is the formation of UF6, and when it leaks out, it reacts with the water vapor in the atmosphere and forms urinal fluoride, UO2F2. Recent study in 2006 tracks the geographic movement of UO2F2 from a central enrichment facility, and so we hope to apply our techniques for the detection of UO2F2. And so I'll be presenting kind of my preliminary work this summer to start this project. So, as mentioned previously, we want to look at UO2F2 signal directly and not dissociate the atom or the molecule as most breakdown techniques that I mentioned previously do. So one of the primary goals of the summer was to see if we can excite molecules without necessarily dissociating them with a gaseous target. So a laser induced plasma with a gaseous target I will refer to as a spark. So again, this is for the purpose of UO2F2 sensing. So we look at some of the dominant heating mechanisms for the surrounding gas, because the plasma is much too hot, and within the plasma itself, created by the laser breakdown process, you are going to see dissociated atoms and ions more so than actual molecular signals. So what we want to do is we want to look outside the plasma at the surrounding gas, which is heated by potential mechanisms listed here. So the prompt electrons, which originate from the interaction of the laser pulse with the target, or the gaseous target, radiative heating. So as the plasma forms, it emits UV radiation that could potentially excite the surrounding gas. And there's detonative heating, so as the plasma forms, it also forms a shock wave, shown here. And as the shock wave expands and interacts with the surrounding gas, it may excite that gas. So the optical setup we used, we've got our breakdown laser going into our target chamber, and we do spectroscopy with this collection system here. And we also do some shadowgraphy to obtain those shockwave images here. So with shadowgraphy, we shine a backlight laser onto a detector to identify the changes in refractive index due to the changes in pressure resulting from the shockwave. And so here's our actual system, and here it is annotated. So our ablation laser goes downwards, creates a vertical spark within our target chamber. Here is our backlight, which loops around through our plasma onto our detector, and our spectrograph for spectroscopy. So this is a summary of our results. The black and white image is the shock wave as a function of time. This image is a spectral image just with an ICCD camera of our plasma. So this is the inside of the shock wave, and you can see how the shape changes. And over here at the bottom are the spectral features at each various location with respect to the center of our plasma. And so obviously you get the most emission from the center. At early times, you see this very intense UV radiation, which could cause that radiative heating of the surrounding gas. And we see appearance of specific spectroscopic features even at the outer edges, even prior to the arrival of the shock. So here it is in still images, and here's what I'm talking about. So we see the appearance, for example, of the oxygen triplet at around 400 nanoseconds, whereas the shock wave doesn't reach the 2.5 millimeter zone until about 4,500 nanoseconds after the arrival of the laser pulse. And so we are able to, this implies that detonative heating is kind of negligible in the heating of the surrounding gas. And again, we're looking at the heating of the surrounding gas because we want to investigate the formation of excited molecular structures such as UO2, F2 without dissociating the molecule. And so we did some similar studies with argon just to try to understand our fundamentals. You can see that the shock as well as the plasma itself exhibit different morphologies, and you see different spectroscopic features. However, in this case, it is similar to air because we do see emission prior to the arrival of the shock. So we have to do some more research on radiative heating and prompt electrons as to see what exactly is causing that. So we did some modeling work to back this up using CFD modeling with in a software package called OpenFoam. And here's a summary of our results. So the pressure contours correspond to the shock waves, whereas the temperature contours correspond to the internal plasma. And kind of the coup de grace of what we came up with is our shock wave compared to our pressure contour with the model. You can see they are in pretty good agreement. And running short on time, so I'll conclude. So we did some experimental work and some modeling work to try to understand the fundamentals of sparks for plausible applications in UO2, F2 sensing. With that, are there any questions?
Shown on the top left image there. So we have an EJ309, which is a liquid organic scintillator. It's 3 by 3 inches. And we also have still beam crystals, which are 2 by 2 inches. As many of you know, these are